If I'm guilty, it means that I am the ultimate figure to fear, because I'm not the obvious one.
The girl known as Foxy Knoxs.
Everyone is talking about it.
I mean, it was a feeding frenzy for everyone. What more do you want in a story? I mean, all you're missing is the royal family and the Pope.
I've known her only for 5 days.
Perché la ragazza è stata coperta? All'uomo, a uno sconosciuto, non verrebbe in mente questa cosa.
Did you kill Meredith?
How did things get to this point?
Amanda Knox.
If I'm innocent, it means that everyone's vulnerable. And that's everyone's nightmare. Either I'm a psychopath in sheep's clothing, or I am you.
All right, let's talk about this movie, about the media and a country's persecution of an innocent woman. No parallels at all, right? No parallels. Amanda Knox, how did this start for you guys? How did you meet her? How did you start sort of building this story with her?
Well, we started working on this film in 2011. Well, at the time, we didn't know it was going to be a film, but we were sort of fascinated with the way the world was fascinated about this case and had become obsessed with Amanda Knox. And we wanted to understand why the stories that we were being told and the narratives that we were being presented with had moved so far away from this examination of this tragedy and trying to find justice at its heart. And we wanted to know why that had happened, why people were so obsessed with her, and then what it would be like for all of these people to be kind of caught up inside of that circle.
So your initial interests were the narratives that were sort of being created around her in this story. And what did you find when you started digging into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that was so interesting was this case was actually happening at this pivotal moment in kind of the transition where media goes digital. And Facebook is launching around this time. It kind of becomes the rise of, Twitter comes shortly after. And so you see all of a sudden the rise of clickbait journalism and headline-based journalism. And what we really found interesting was that this story caught on in a culture that suddenly wanted everything in a sentence or two because it had all these kind of salacious elements.
Sentence or a photo.
A sentence or a photo, yeah. In fact, I remember one of the kind of initial headlines that was so interesting to us was on the first day of Amanda's trial, there was a headline, it was a picture of her where she was smiling. And the headline was, "Smiling, Laughing on Trial for Murder." And so it was so interesting to us, the framing of that. And then as the case kind of evolved and changed in 2011, when the evidence really changed, the coverage also evolved to kind of fit that narrative. And so, I think it's something that we certainly found in the election as well, this kind of morphing of coverage to fit, a really compelling story.
I want to get there in a second, but let's refresh people on Amanda Knox's story. She was this exchange student. Was she an exchange student, or was she just living in Italy?
She was studying there, abroad.
She was studying there, and she was essentially convicted of murdering her roommate at one point, and there was an Italian prosecutor who really had it in for her, and then it turned out there was literally no DNA evidence, and she was exonerated, but at the same time, he still believes that she is guilty.
Well, they were convicted, acquitted, convicted, and acquitted. So there were 4 total trials, over the course of 8 years.
That's incredible. And now this documentary is amazing because it literally interviews everybody that was a part of this. I mean, is there anyone missing that you didn't get to interview?
Yeah, we would have loved to talk to the victim's family, Meredith Kercher's family, and we reached out to them a number of times. And we've kind of respected their choice to not speak about it. But we included them in archival footage because we thought it was really important to have their side of the story. And then, there are kind of 2 other central people in this story, Ruta Gide, whose DNA is in the kind of murder room, shall we say, and who has acknowledged being at the house that night and was convicted in a separate trial. And his lawyer spoke on his behalf. We would still love to talk to him. And then Patrick Lumumba, who Amanda Knox falsely accused in an interrogation, he declined to participate as well. So, there's still a couple of people, but what we were trying to do is kind of peel back the layers of the onion and get to the kind of center of who were the people that were really core to the way this story was covered.
And what I think is incredible about this documentary, and it was so interesting to hear you just say that it was one of your first initiatives in making it, is that as you're peeling back the layers of the film and you're watching it, suddenly it becomes less a sort of a whodunit or what's going on and how the media is shaping this. It really becomes an indictment of how we cover these stories and the way that the media skews all of these narratives for the purpose of selling papers or getting clickbait. Is that really something that you knew going into it, or did you realize that as you started interviewing this journalist? I don't really want to call him that.
Well, I think we saw very quickly, right, that the narratives that were created played a large part in, putting these people on paths that they couldn't escape from. So kind of once you establish a certain narrative, it's hard for anyone to break free of that. And so the narrative that was established several days in was case closed, caso chiuso. And, Amanda had confessed in the way that the story was being reported at the time. And so, we did see that, kind of once that happens, people can't deviate from that. But then, the conversation shifted so far away from the facts and the, objective evidence to become this piece of entertainment that was exciting for people across the board. And, Nick Pisa, who is the journalist we interviewed in the film, was not just the journalist working for the Daily Mail at the time, but he was reporting for NBC in the States and Sky News in the UK. He was a freelance journalist, and he was there, spoke Italian, and so people were calling him up. He was kind of a mercenary, a journalist for hire. And people needed to sell newspapers and move stories, and people wanted this sort of information, it seemed like, so he wrote the articles that kept people buying the papers.
Yeah, I think that's a really kind of critical point that we try to make in the film, is that it's really our hunger, our collective hunger for these kind of stories that drives that coverage. And so it's a real chicken and the egg situation. I think that's a discussion that we're having a lot now. Is who is kind of to blame for this evolution and this change in the media? Is it really because the media has become so profit focused or so entertainment focused? And I think you can trace that back to kind of the mid '90s, and then
trace that back to the Bronco. I mean, if you want to.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, if I think the way that we kind of talked about it is that was one of the first really famous cases that was covered gavel to gavel on television, and this was really the first kind of case in the social media era that really captures the international attention.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Going back, you have the Bronco, you have like Menendez, Bobbitt. There were those four sort of trials at the moment when court TV really started. That it landed.
Yeah, and there was also the Clinton scandal, right, which was kind of where the alt-right news movement kind of got its beginning. It was what helped Matt Drudge rise to prominence, and so that was really the evolution, right? We talk about Halperin called Drudge the Walter Cronkite of his generation, and so you see that evolution from that kind of hard news traditional. Studio newsman like Cronkite to the internet, headline-driven, kind of Drudge-based news world. And so, just kind of tracing the line between those 2 points, I think is really interesting.
I think, too, what we saw is that the conversation gets moved so far away from where it started, right? So even in the lead up to our election 2 days ago, the mainstream media was talking about these things that were sort of chaff and white noise. When you're talking about how many times Hillary Clinton coughed, or whether or not she needed a pillow, or about where President Obama was born, when it's indisputable where he was born, you've moved the conversation so far away from information, and you've moved it to entertainment and things that appeal to people's emotions. And so that was certainly the way that this story was being presented to people, over the better part of 8 years. People were divided based on how they felt, and that they made headlines and moved papers, got clicks, and the story became this piece of commodified entertainment for the masses.
And when it becomes commodified entertainment, does it become even more tribal, you think, in terms of its divisions?
Yeah.
Like it becomes even more sort of like a sports game. I'm for the Broncos and you're for the Bears.
Yeah.
Sorry, those are teams, right?
Are there Bears fans left? I'm not sure.
Even a team.
But yeah, I mean, it definitely, you look for the stories that reinforce your kind of pre-existing beliefs, and I think that both sides are guilty of that, and I think that I'm not really sure what the step is to move past that.
How do you rein back news for entertainment?
I'm not sure, but I think that
Rein in.
What?
rein in.
Yeah. But I don't know. I think it's something that we're going to be debating a lot in the coming months and years. Because I think there's amazing journalism that's happening out there still, probably more than has ever happened. But it's not the stuff that everyone is tuning into because they feel one way or the other about these organizations, that they're corrupt, that they don't represent them. And so I think that's the discussion that we're seeing a lot of right now is, how do we figure out a way for the media to regain the trust of the people? And I'm not really sure how that happens when...
But at the same time, don't these media organizations, for lack of a better word, mainstream media organizations, cable news, do actually represent the people and their viewing habits and how they watch? The reason that they exist, it is a chicken or the egg conversation to a degree, but the reason that they exist to the way that they are is because they're trying to get viewers and they're trying to get eyeballs, and this is what people watch, how they watch, and what they care about. So clearly, there's a natural instinct for people to be tribal, to be lowest common denominator, and to look at news as entertainment and not be able to sort of decipher between what's important and what isn't,
Yeah, the kind of moment where Nick Pisa in the film talks, presents this idea that, people want to know what's going on. People are interested in this stuff, is after Amanda Knox's prison diary is leaked. So basically what happens is after Amanda's arrested, she's told that she has HIV and that she's going to develop AIDS. This is while she's in prison. And so she writes in her prison diary, she is trying to kind of figure out who could have given her this terrible virus. And so she writes down a list of everyone she slept with. And that diary is then taken from her and it's leaked to the media. Pisa is one of the first people that gets a hold of it. And it becomes front page news all over the world. And so, he says in the film, I would never, journalists don't divulge their sources. I'm not going to say how I got this. But, at the end of the day, everyone is kind of tuning in and they want to know more. And I think that, that kind of raises this, it comes back to this question, are we feeding the desire for this so much that these things that really are not relevant to guilt or innocence, in this case, or relevant to really, the kind of larger issues become so prevalent and dominate the news because they're so exciting and titillating. So it's really, I think, about us making a decision on what we care about moving forward. Do we want to return to a time when kind of the news and the media was all for the public good, and when there was a kind of bond there where you didn't really know what the political viewpoints of the media, the top members of the media were. That was kind of a core tenet of the media in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And so it'll be interesting to see if we move back in that direction.
At the same time, I don't know if objectivity is that, just to briefly have this conversation, I don't know if objectivity is the sort of the direction to go when it comes to the media at this point. I mean, I think,
but this is the conversation. It's about balance versus. So objectivity does not mean that there is no factual outcome, right? I think that if you look back at the way that the media covered things in the past, it was objective, but there were objective facts to present to people. So when lies were told, it was clear that they were lies, and people accepted that and what that meant. And now it's all about balance, which just means if one person says something, then you let the other side respond to it. And so there's not that firm hand guiding the rudder, shall we say, saying what's true and what's not. And so both sides can say whatever they want, and there's not as much accountability. And I think that's the issue. It's not so much that there's a problem with objectivity. I think objectivity is important. It's just you have to get to the objective facts as well.
And then even when you present the facts, though, people just can write them off if they don't believe it or they don't want to feel that it's true. I mean, Newt Gingrich said that on John Oliver, a couple months ago, that people are accessing information and they don't care if it's factually accurate or not. They'll just say, well, I don't want to believe that, therefore it's not true, even if it is objectively true.
Yeah, in the 80s, and I heard this recently, Ronald Reagan enacted some of the first sort of climate change policy because scientists came to him and said, hey, we're putting holes in the ozone layer. And he was like, okay, great, let's put a ban on aerosol to a degree. And that's a Republican president who did that. And we can't have that conversation anymore because even though 99% of scientists say that climate change is real, CNN, all the news organizations are going to be like, well, here's the scientist and here's the person who says that it's not real, so you guys make up your mind.
Yeah, it's a pundit culture instead of a...
But it's also indisputable, right? So if you have an objective fact, how does it become then a conversation in our media? So in our film, of course, there's pundits debating Amanda Knox's innocence or guilt, and they're coming to conclusions about how we should react. Or in our film, Donald Trump is saying, I think we should boycott Italy. And when the conversation has moved so far away from an examination of the fact, and then like applying justice in this case, why have we moved it there? And well, it's because it's entertaining, right? And it gets people to tune in, and it turns it into episodic content almost that just gets people on the hook moment after moment, in the Situation Room, just tuning in for nothing.
And that's how we get the president that we have right now. Boycott Italy?
Yeah, well, we'll get to see if he follows through on that.
Yeah.
The funny thing is that at the time, right, when he's suggesting in our film that, we boycott Italy, and he's saying America should get involved at the highest levels, he's actually referring to Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State at the time.
Let's talk about Amanda Knox. How did you guys get her to participate in the film? I imagine she has a heavy distrust of those who want to tell her story.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't just Amanda, to be honest. It was every single one of these people had been villainized in some way or another on both sides of the courtroom. So we approached Amanda in 2011 after she came back to Seattle after her first appeals trial, and she said she didn't want to do a documentary. And she changed her mind a couple of years later and got back in touch with us, and we had kind of thought, okay, well, this project isn't going to move forward because we only wanted to make a film if we could have both sides, if we could have this first-person feeling to the film, because there's been so much written about it, and we wanted to make sure that what we were adding to the conversation was valuable and new and fresh, and not just regurgitating this story that had been covered in such a salacious way.
Making like an ID discovery of
exactly. So when Amanda came back to us, it was late 2013. We did an interview with her in early 2014. And then we spent really another year trying to convince the Italian prosecutor, Giuliano Menini, to participate. And he had really felt misrepresented by the American media as well. He had done one kind of CNN interview that it was 4 hours long and had been trimmed down to 30 seconds. And voiceover had been put over the top of it, and so he felt like he hadn't been heard either. And
has he seen the film?
Yeah, everyone has seen the film.
How has he responded to the film? Does he feel heard?
Yeah, everyone that's seen the film thought it was a really kind of faithful representation of how they feel. And it was important for us. That was kind of part of the pact that we made with each of these people, that if they trusted us with their stories before the film was seen by the rest of the world, we would come and show it to them. And that was kind of important for the trust building, because really all these people, it was tough, I think, for them to trust in this kind of project.
It took a long time to get Giuliano Menini on board, to hear from Amanda. But I think the other thing that took us a great deal of time was getting a hold of the case files that were being held in Florence at the time. Because what you find, of course, in the film is that you have all these people talking about these events retrospectively and how they were and what they were and who they were. And it was really important to contextualize all of that, right? So to find the audio recordings that were made of Amanda's phone calls, or the prison audio recordings between Amanda and her mother, or the video footage that Amanda shot of Meredith Kercher on her digital camera, very right before Meredith was tragically murdered. All those things had been missing from the sort of single frames that we had been presented in the coverage here. And all of that could contextualize all of these things that these people were saying and sort of make you look at it in a different way. So you could hear their version of the truth, and then you could actually see them in the moment or feel it in the moment. And that was very important to constructing the film. So it wasn't just getting them involved as people. It was trying to find all of that information that could really, round out the film.
And you guys maintain, as filmmakers, you maintain a fairly objective stance. You're telling Amanda's story, you're telling the prosecutor's story, you're telling the reporter's story. And even though you maintain an objective stance, I think some people have come out and been like, this is propaganda.
Yes.
Which goes back to what you were saying before, which is that even if you just present facts to people, they want to remain in their tribe and they want to stand firmly there.
Well, I think that, look, we based the kind of structure of the film off of the final Supreme Court verdict. And so, that was really important for us because the story had been so divisive that we knew going into it that there was these kind of two camps, right? And as soon as you say anything that that makes it seem as though you believe anything that anyone else says, you get kind of thrown into one of these camps. And so for us, we just looked at this final legal verdict, and we structured the whole film around that, because at the end of the day, that's actually the conclusion that was come to. And so, you know, when we were kind of figuring out how do you tell a story that takes place over 10 years, essentially, it was really helpful to have that document, because we knew, you know, where the film was kind of headed. And then for us, it was about kind of letting the people reveal their personalities. So, you know, it's not a trial film. We really set out to not kind of make that kind of a movie. We wanted it to be a character-driven film, where I think you actually learn more about the story and how it happened by hearing, you know, the worldviews and the stories from the characters that were at the heart of it. And then, you know, there's certainly plenty of supplementary reading that's out there if people want to learn more about the case.
Yeah, people have asked us too, you know, based on the way that they feel about these individuals, they would say, well, why would you spend time with an evil man? Or why, you know, do you think Amanda was guilty, if they're referring to Giuliano Menini or Amanda Knox? And they're approaching this, you know, based on how they feel and through the lens that they already see everything through. And I think what we wanted to do was to show that these are all very real people that have been caught up in this and that had this thing happen to them. And at the end of the day, they're all human beings who deserve our empathy, regardless of how you feel about right or wrong or who did what. And it was very important for us while making the film, but when we showed it to everybody before the film was released publicly, both Amanda and Giuliano Menini commented that they saw the other person as a human being more so for the first time. Giuliano Menini, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, said Amanda's very well spoken and intelligent, and Amanda recognized how Giuliano's background and his family really played a part in him, like being a part of the story. And to have that happen as documentary filmmakers is wonderful, because we are trying to find the heart and the human experience at the inside of the story.
I have to ask, does it kind of blow your mind, for lack of a better phrase, that it's still divisive even though she's been acquitted by the Supreme Court and the DNA evidence is so strongly in her favor? I mean, it's not even in her favor. It's essentially 100%, and that Rudy Guide, right? You know, his DNA is everywhere. He literally left his bowels in the toilet. Like it's so obvious. Why is it still so divisive?
I think that, you know, in that final Supreme Court verdict, one of the things that they talk about is that the evidence collection was done in such a haphazard manner that it will kind of forever leave questions, right? That if the collection had been done better, that, you know, there would be a much clearer picture of guilt or innocence. And so I think that, you know, because of that, essentially there was no evidence found of Amanda or Raffaele in the room where it happened that was reliable. But because of that kind of the repudiation of the actual evidence collection, I think it creates this gray area for people to really continue believing whatever they want. And, you know, at the end of the day, none of us will really ever know, except for the people that were there that night, whoever they may be, Rudy Guide being the only one that we know has actually acknowledged being there that night. You know, we'll never really know what happened. And so I think that actually plays into a kind of cultural and universal fear of, you know, a tragedy like this happening to someone. Amanda talks about it at the end of the film, you know, this idea that, you know, we want to know who the bad person is and that it's not us. And I think that's a really universal thing. And I think that, you know, that actually leads people to a bunch of different conclusions and to feel, you know, a bunch of different ways based on how they kind of react to that kind of core fear.
Absolutely. I want to open it up to the audience for questions. Who has questions?
Hey guys, I think it's really fascinating what you guys are doing for this film, so definitely can't wait to check it out. So I was wondering, like, did you have to try to put aside feelings about the case itself while you guys were making the documentary?
I mean, I think that, look, when you're making a film about something that split, the world was really split kind of 50-50 on this story. So even within our filmmaking team, because it's a lot more than just us two, you know, it takes so many people to make a film. Our editor, Matt Hamachek, who's amazing, he made this movie Cartel Land last year, which I'd recommend everyone watches if they haven't seen it.
He edited it?
He edited, yeah. And, you know, and then there are dozens more people involved. And so, you know, we really there were so many different opinions on what had happened, and kind of the job for us was really to put aside all of that. And that was why the final Supreme Court verdict was so important to structuring the film, because it allowed us to say, well, it doesn't really matter what we feel. What's important here is what this final verdict says, and then how can we kind of get to the heart of these people and let them, tell you a little bit about themselves.
Next question.
Hi. What differences did you guys find between American and Italian legal systems?
Well, that's something that's very interesting, right? Is that the Italian legal system is a three-tier justice system. So things aren't over until they're finalized by the Italian Supreme Court. And of course, that's not the way our system works. And so Italy would be very quick to point out that their justice system does work, it just takes much longer than we're used to. So we viewed it as, well, this girl and Raffaele Solecito are being tried twice for the same crime, when that's not at all.
In America, that was kind of a common thought. Not us, but one of the things that was important for us was understanding the differences, right? So in Italy, basically what happened in this case is both sides can appeal a verdict. So in the States, we're kind of used to, the quote unquote losing side is the one that appeals. Well, what happened in this case was after Amanda was found guilty, both sides actually appealed that verdict. And then when Amanda was found, it was acquitted in 2011, Amanda and Raffaele were acquitted, then the prosecution appealed that verdict, and that went to the Italian Supreme Court. And what the Italian Supreme Court does is they look at kind of the legal proceedings to determine whether there are any problems with process or things like that. And they then ordered a second appellate level trial. We're digging a little bit into the legalese, but essentially what happens is your appellate level decision goes to the Italian Supreme Court, and they then can kind of ratify that decision or send it back for a new appellate trial. And so there were there was never a double jeopardy situation in this case. It was just the first appellate level acquittal was basically discarded, and they started from scratch.
Next question.
I watched this a few weeks ago, and I really, really liked it, but I found myself hating Nick Pizza and journalists. So I'm wondering, how did the media's coverage and his coverage, how did they affect this case, if at all?
Well, Nick Pizza, of course, is emblematic of a type of journalism that was coming to be at that time period. Brian was talking about it earlier, that things were moving online, being reduced to headlines, 140 characters, things that were clickable. And so Nick was important to us because he was one of the first journalists on the scene. There were certainly many other journalists there. He spoke Italian, so he had a leg up on a lot of his competitors, and he was really good at getting scoops. And Nick was doing his job, right? He was a freelance journalist tasked with reporting on these events, and he also needed to sell newspapers. So the media definitely played a part in constructing a narrative. But once you set a narrative in place, once it's case closed, confession, there's evidence of them at the crime scene, which is how it read initially in 2007, it's very hard for anybody to deviate from that narrative. And in any situation, not just in a true crime story.
But I think that, the other thing that's important to keep in mind is Nick as a freelancer, and this is something that we don't talk a lot about, is, he's getting paid per story, right? So I think a lot of people want to rush to villainize people in this story, and it's happened on both sides. And I think what we're trying to do in the film is to argue against, creating a villain out of one person or out of one entity. I think that, as we were talking about earlier, there's really an accountability that all of us have in these kind of situations. And I think that, if you're thinking about someone making $80 to $150 a story, a lot of people have pointed out that Nick at the end of the film says, I just simply didn't have the time to double check my sources before I printed, because a competitor would beat him to it. Well, if you're competing, for that $80 to $150, right, and you need to put food on the table for your family, it creates a real dilemma there. And I think that the kind of larger question is not about Nick, but is about, what are the systems that we've put in place and our own kind of interests in this kind of journalism? What have they created? And what are the consequences of that? Do we care whether our news gets fact-checked, for example? And I think that's a question that goes far beyond Nick.
And that sort of opens me up to my next question, which I rarely ask because you're here promoting one thing and it's weird to ask this and I think it's kind of lazy. But what are you working on next? Because this opens so many doors. It's not just a true crime investigation. It opens so many doors for new topics. I'm wondering if you finish this and you were like, now I want to explore this one thing in here that we talked about a little bit more, but find a different story that does it.
Yes, there are a couple of things that I'm working on in that vein, and then I make a show called Chef's Table for Netflix as well. So we're just finishing up a new season of that.
I think right now I'm just trying to get enough sleep and recover from 2 days ago. I mean, it is interesting to think about the power of narratives and the way that stories get disseminated and understood by people, and I think that that's something we're both fascinated with as filmmakers, as storytellers, and as individuals, and we'll probably be trying to work through that for the rest of our lives.
I mean, it must be so fascinating to have just made this documentary where a huge portion of it is about news as entertainment, and we're seeing our first president elected essentially based off of news as entertainment. I mean, his main platform was rallies on CNN, Fox, all of the news channels, these very entertaining, boisterous, crazy rallies where you never knew what was going to happen.
Right, we're addicted to that sort of thing. We're addicted to that feeling, and we want to be entertained. It seems like.
At the same time, I think, not to play devil's advocate, but I think that if you go back to 2007, 2008, and you look at Obama's rise to the presidency, I think while certainly his politics are radically different than Donald Trump's, and maybe we may fall more in line with kind of his way of looking at the world, the way that he really told a really amazing story. There was a really powerful narrative about what America could be, and certainly very different than Donald Trump's narrative. But I think if you go back and look through time, I think that we've always kind of gravitated towards the people who tell us the story that captures the zeitgeist of the moment. And so in some ways, I think that you can kind of track this back well before we kind of talk about the 24-hour news cycle and everything. But at the same time, I think you're totally right that this is the first time when we really have had no idea what the fundamental policy ideas of the person that we're electing are. And so that is definitely driven by this kind of entertainment standard that's been set in the media now, where we really want to discuss more what someone is saying or how they're saying it, or what's going on at the rallies, more than actually demanding a kind of content. So that's the big change in my view.
Absolutely. Guys, the documentary Amanda Knox is on Netflix now, right? Chef Table as well is also on Netflix.
Yes.
Congratulations. Thanks so much for being here. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Thanks,
guys.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you.